Hey everyone, this evening we'll start with the gloomy, perilous, and unglamorous world of medieval assassins. Those eerie individuals who used a blade and a whisper to alter history as they slipped through dimly lit alleys and castle corridors. Even though they appear cool in Hollywood, being a medieval assassin was really awful. It's always interesting to see who is joining us from all over the world. So before you settle in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you truly love what I do here. You can also let me know in the comments where you're listening in from and what time it is for you. Now turn down the lights, perhaps turn on a fan to provide a gentle background hum as we begin our journey together tonight. Let's be clear. You know what? I'd like to stab a nobleman in the throat for 12 silver coins and the honor of hiding in a barrel for 3 days. Was not a statement made by anyone in the Middle Ages. Assassination was not a vocation. It was more akin to the final stop on the train of a life gone terribly wrong. The majority of medieval killers weren't mysterious loners received training in temples on mountains. Desperate peasants, humiliated soldiers, former robbers with good aim, or someone so isolated from society that they could murder a guy and still go unnoticed in the census. You wouldn't become an assassin if you were wealthy. You employed one. You were in management if you owned a title to land or even a goat. But if you were just escaping Data's prison, you were known for being able to solve difficulties and enter a tavern covertly. Congratulations! You weren't asked to take out Bob the quiet turnip farmer, and someone was going to mumble a name while sliding a coin purse over the table. Typically, it was a dishonest baron, a wealthy bishop, or someone with a moat and 12 bodyguards. By the time someone gave it some thought, they had nothing left to lose, despite the job's awful compensation. Without family, without a future, and without a dental plan. Of course, not to mention the complete dearth of benefits offered by the employer. You couldn't exactly hang up a shingle that read, "Quiet eliminations by appointment," without a pension, honor, or evenings off. You simply needed to keep quiet, move quickly, and never disclose your occupation to anyone. Not loudly over ale in the inn, in particular. Yes, I sell carpets on the road. You know, the stains die. Indeed, no one aspired to be a medieval killer. Wearing a hood and brandishing a rusty knife, they landed there after being gnawed up and spat out by the world. You weren't the protagonist, even you weren't the bad guy. You were the addendum that caused anxiety in everyone, and most likely prevented them from enjoying the coin. Let's dispel the first myth completely. There was no montage, no instructor, and no motivational speech when medieval assassins trained in a secret monastery with wise mentors and uplifting flute music playing in the background. If there was one thing you learned, it was that you didn't die the first few times you tried. The majority of killers weren't qualified experts. They were frantic amateurs who could climb silently without sneezing and had a fair sense of direction. If you were in the military, you probably knew how to handle a knife correctly. If not, stabbing someone is quite obvious. But you can still get away with both kidneys intact. That requires talent, or good fortune. Usually, it's just luck. No instructions were available, no safety briefings or guild orientation meetings. You weren't taught where nobility kept their bedroom exits or how to recognize a body double. You hung from a window and worked it out. I'm still wondering if you sneaked back into the servants' quarters. I'm also might being choy in the liddy silly. In the time, that involved a lot of trial and error, and occasionally it worked. Sometimes your victim simply became a little light-headed and became more wary of his soup. You may occasionally have sipped the wrong cup. Medieval times did not exist. I hope you have a strong stomach and herbal guessing. Yes, you might have learned certain talents from mercenaries or thieves, if you were lucky. I mean lottery lucky. Perhaps you learned how to walk on cobblestones without squeaking from an elder assassin. However, mentoring wasn't common. Assassins never retire. They just vanish. Thus, it was uncommon and brief. Forget about weapons training. You didn't have a broadsword with you. You were a man with calloused hands, silent footfall, and a very unhealthy connection with alleyways. You had a knife that you took from a guard, possibly a garrote if you were feeling fancy, and whatever else fit under your cloak without jingling. Survival, not training, was the key to success. You mastered the art of murder by executing it hastily and disappearing before anyone could draw your face and affix it to a church door. To put it briefly, you had a brutally practical education with no graduation celebrations. Let's discuss why you became an assassin in the first place. All you have are bruises, bloodstains, and the nagging sense that you were mostly on your own. Cold, weighty, wonderfully jangling coin that can be spent. What drew you in was the promise of it. But in actuality, you were paid lies. When someone hires an assassin, they desire a one-time service rather than a long-term partnership. No documentation, and preferably, you and no witnesses. When the task is over, they give you a pouch of silver. Half now, half later, if they're feeling giving. But here's the thing. After we make sure you didn't mess it up, make us look bad, leave a trail that leads back to us, or live long enough to tell anyone about it, the code is for after the work is finished. Thus, you perform the work. It's neither lyrical or attractive to sneak through shadows and possibly assassinate a baron when he's sleeping, and when you get back, the client ran away, apologizing profusely, or worse, they tried to murder you. A bonus is more expensive than a knife to the gut, and even when you do receive payment, it's never nearly enough. Not because of the danger, not because of the blood, and not because of the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack, covered in fleas and feeling guilty. A few coins, a quick nod, and a reminder that you were never present are given to you. Fun fact, some of the contracts were fraudulent. Political pitfalls. You would be instructed to kill a dangerous person, only to discover that it was a ruse with guards on standby. Congratulations, you entered a sting operation with your name already engraved on the gallows, and you were unable to register a complaint in court, even if the bargain was genuine. I would like to sue Lord Edmund for breach of assassination contract, Your Honor. You learned to take what you could, demand payment beforehand, and to have no faith in anyone. Not even the greasy little writer who promised this job would alter your life, because the only court you would see was the one where you were the exhibit. Mostly, it did so by making it shorter. Living off of broken promises and disappearing before they broke you was what it meant to be an assassin. You accepted the job, were misled about the salary, and are most likely going to die. Let's speak about gear now. Put the sneaking video games and fantasy books away. No retractable wrist blades were present. Enchanted daggers, smoke bombs, or crossbows that fit perfectly in your boot. If you were lucky enough to find a gold coin in a dead man's shoe, you possessed a nice dagger. Otherwise, your toolkit was anything you could take, sharpen, or conceal under a torn cloak without making a clanking sound. Not curved like a dragon's tooth, nor elaborate. It should be sharp, free of rust, and ideally not smell like the last person you stabbed. Poison. Although it did exist, a gradual drip into a wine goblet was more glitzy. The majority of medieval poisons were erratic and created from toad guts, minerals, or plants. Some worked right away, some took hours, and some caused your sufferer to throw up for 2 days before getting better. I'm furious and distrustful of stew now. Sometimes ropes are helpful. Nothing detracts from the mood like attempting to wrestle someone while moaning, Wait, which knot goes under again? You could use one to strangle, climb, or tie anything up, but you'd best know how to use it quickly. Bows. If you had one, understood how to shoot it, and were attempting to sneak it past a palace while posing as a flower arranger, then the answer is definitely yes. The majority of assassinations were intimate. You didn't have backups, so there was no time for graceful marksmanship. Just a quick, silent, and hopefully untidy enough to slide in. Should your blade break, bend, or fall into a well, it's time to get creative. Perhaps a slate roof tile. Rusty nails are worth trying. With purpose, the shoe buckle. Times of desperation. Because your weapon was your best friend, your boss, and your only retirement plan in this line of work. You kept your tools near at hand, not for safety, but because you could hide them in your boots or inside hollowed-out bread if necessary. No improvements were made, no adjusting equipment in between missions. Since it wasn't the weapon that killed you in the end, you didn't polish your kit and hoped it wouldn't turn on you in the middle of an attack. You were the only one who was ill-prepared and expected to work miracles with just a spoon and a prayer. The purpose of hiring assassins was not to eliminate drunks in back alleys. You were not paid to stab Jeff, the drowsy candle maker. Your goals were significant. Bishops, nobles, military officers, and, occasionally, even members of royalty. And those individuals were extremely difficult to eliminate. First, there were the guards. Not a single or 2 dozen, well-fed, armed and armored. Some waited there, appearing menacing, daring you to blink incorrectly, while others guarded the front and back. Before the asthmatic night required a break, you would spend days learning patrol routines, door creaks, and the precise number of stairs. Secondly, there were walls. Instead of front porches, castles had gated murder pits, and mows filled the venomous objects. Even if you avoided falling into the water, you still had to be concerned about boiling oil and arrow slits. Indeed, boiling oil. Third, there were the staff, chefs, scribes, and stable boys. Your work description said that you might be fired for looking. If you were to give them the wrong look, they would be whispering to the guard captain before you could say, "I'm just the herbalist." Assassins weren't simply battling swords. They were also fighting rumors. And rumors spread quickly in the Middle Ages if they allow someone to keep their head. Lastly, your real target is paranoid. These individuals were, understandably, surrounded by treacherous relatives who claimed their titles, and 3 dozen people who pretended to like them. Without a tester, they didn't eat. Without 3 locks on the door, they couldn't sleep. Some even slept in rotating rooms or decoy beds, which are lethal variations of musical chairs. And if you find out they're going to a feast, don't get too enthusiastic. You will still need to get past the royal guards, even though they will be intoxicated. 3 canines, 50 witnesses, and a vigilant jester are holding tanks. It can take weeks to even approach your goal, bribing a chambermaid concealed in barrels while posing as a servant. And you only had one chance when the time arrived. During the night, a single, flawless, non-squeaky, non-bloody ghost disappeared. Alternatively, you would be the next public disincentive, hung from the castle gate with a sign that said, "Nice try." Let's be truthful. In reality, you appeared to be a sick goat herder with something to conceal. When you think of a medieval assassin, you usually image sleek black robes, leather braces, and possibly a mysterious hood that billowed in the moonlight. During the Middle Ages, disguises weren't really fashionable. You didn't have retractable armor or specially made cloaks. Instead, you used whatever peasant rags you could find. the remnants of a guard outfit that undoubtedly still had the scent of its former owner, or a monk's robe that was 2 sizes too large. The intention was to fit in, but doing so meant appearing like everyone else who hadn't taken a shower in 2 weeks, was limping from previous injuries, and was twitching nervously from starvation. Your cloak didn't make you appear suspicious. Rather, it was the way you kept shifting your belt to conceal a cheesecloth-wrapped blade. Masks aren't necessary. There were no possibilities for mail forks. The majority of facial covers only made you appear leprous, which was excellent for avoiding conversation, but awful for going to parties. You had to think quickly if someone questioned who you were. "My name is Brother Tobias, and I handle rooftop upkeep and silent prayer." Even if you managed to get past the guards, noble homes weren't teeming with fools. Aside from getting struck with a candlestick, servants always saw new faces, especially those who fumbled with chamber pots and couldn't identify the cook's cat. And congrats if your disguise was successful. Now you had to spend hours acting as though you didn't see all the extremely stab-worthy persons passing by, and that there were no wigs. You were forced to spread dirt on your face, squint, and hope that no one could see that your beard was glued on with honey, if you wanted to appear older or younger. In actuality, your disguise didn't keep you safe. Instead, it confused you for perhaps 5 minutes. In the medieval era, if you were an assassin, you didn't have a team, a sidekick with a crossbow, a cunning alchemist in a secret lair, or a handler who gave you coded scrolls and encouraging words. After that, you had to be made invisible or extremely convincing. If someone saw through it, well, let's just say that nobody wants to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room wearing a nun's habit and brandishing a sword, especially on a feast day. You had serious trust issues and a rusty dagger. If there were rumors of a brotherhood of assassins, they were mainly pub chatter driven by me and boredom. There were no guilds, at least not ones you could truly rely on. Meeting a ghost was more likely than running into another professional killer looking to expand their network. Why the isolation? Because the more you lived in your business, the less people realized you existed. Every interaction was dangerous. Each loose mouth could be a noose. Your client may not even be aware of your true name, and if they were, you were already preparing to go. Friendship. Laughable. Friends inquired. Lovers saw bloodstains, bruises, and the reason you usually slept with a blade beneath your pillow. You were unable to afford to settle down. One mistake, one person recognizing you at a market, and your whole existence turned into a run for the next sewer grate. Even other criminals avoided each other. Smugglers and thieves were friendly. People frightened you, or worse, thought you were a walking liability. Because you were that guy who made people vanish. Nobody wanted to share stew with someone whose line of work may draw a group of people brandishing torches. Furthermore, you couldn't express to anyone how difficult it was to fall asleep after silently strangling a dishonest bishop. So don't expect pity. People thought you were lying or dangerous if you discussed your work. And they weren't mistaken. You sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, and kept your secrets, scars, and weapons to yourself. Your eyes were constantly on the entrance. You didn't say your name until someone paid you first, and even then, it was probably not your genuine one. You also never drank too much, or remained more than a night. Mastering the art of disappearance was essential for medieval assassins. In every life you've never had, not simply in a crowd. Let's imagine you took the job. You planned your journey. The correct doorman was bought off by you. You passed for an extremely convincing chimney sweeper. Then you became motionless. Maybe the target turned around unexpectedly. They might have been with their child. Perhaps your knife hand trembled like a scared squirrel when you got the shakes at the worst possible time. You're dead now. Guess what? Because a medieval assassin's failure was not a performance assessment or a slap on the wrist. With names like the Bonecracker's Delight, it was a terrible and outrageously theatrical public death that frequently involved ropes, fire wheels, or sharp iron devices. The entire operation would be blown if the kill was missed. Your target survived and informed everyone right away that they had been the victim of a murder attempt. The guards you once slipped past are now motivated, and all of a sudden you were no longer a shadow. You were a wanted man with a thorough description, and most likely a rough sketch posted to every tavern wall within 30 meters. Sometimes you had to think about your client rather than your aim. You were no longer an asset if you failed. You were a liability, someone who might be subjected to torture, questioning, or worse. Speak. There were no second chances, and the individuals who paid you would be the first to offer you a second contract. No, sorry, the blade slipped. I'll try again tomorrow. You had one shot, one instant in time. And if you blew it, the best you could hope for was to die fast, before anyone found out who hired you. Shame was another consequence of failure. The kind of humiliating silence. You didn't simply not kill. You were unable to remain invisible. Being flawless was essential to assassin's survival. If you don't, you might as well start practicing your last words and paint a bullseye on your back. No one was interested in your 12 successes, regardless of how many jobs you had completed in the past. Since you're only as good as your previous kill, in this line of work, you'd better start running if that didn't happen. You did it then. The strategy was successful. The dagger made a real hit. Congratulations. There were no cries or guards, just a clean plummet to the ground and a very significant individual who was no longer. Now, flee for your life. Because being a successful assassin in the Middle Ages meant escaping through back alleyways with someone's blood on your boots and a dog already sniffing your trail. Not drinking wine on a rooftop as the city burned behind you. There was no victory lap, no post-work drink with coworkers, and no informal client debrief. You didn't even have time to appreciate your work before your blade struck your new employment. And now everyone is trying to kill you in ever more creative ways. Horses on the opposite side of town were tied up, and guards were coming through the doors. You're most likely bleeding. Before the kill, you had to arrange your escape. Routes that conceal backup routes. Given that the city would be placed under lockdown in a matter of minutes, perhaps a boatman owed you a favor, or at the very least, avoided asking questions. Nobody desired a scandal, and lockdown meant armed checkpoints, closed gates, and a dozen irate men brandishing swords who had just received your rough sketch and the words, possibly armed and extremely stabby. And let's not forget about the client. If they truly intended to pay you, they wouldn't be meeting you at a nice tavern with a thank you card and a smile. They would most likely disappear as well, because the most dangerous person in the world is an assassin who has just finished a job. Even after you succeeded, you left with a huge target on your back and a coin in one hand. What did you gain from a week of sleeping in hofts, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark, and posing as Brother Lucien while attempting to blend in with monks traveling east? You knew too much. Because survival does not equate to achievement. You made the kill, since it required you to restart the entire game in a different city with a different name and more people searching for you. Run like crazy now. Because assassins were not only feared, but also viewed as cursed in the Middle Ages. If being a poor assassin and sleeping in goat-smelling areas wasn't already awful enough, you also had to cope with the incredibly inventive paranoia of those around you. To the typical peasant, you were more than simply a hooded killer. You were an unclean being who, beneath a full moon, smeared frog guts on your blade and spoke to demons. Why else would you be able to elude guards and disappear in the shadows? Superstition was rampant at the time, but logic wasn't exactly common. Some people thought assassins could change their shape. Others asserted that unless you were cleansed with holy water, you were invisible. According to a well-known legend, assassins could breathe death through walls and create pacts with woodland spirits. Imagine hearing a woman murmur, "Don't make eye contact," while strolling through a village. Even your tools were suspicious, and he might still hex the baby. Having a dagger on hand. It was obviously made in a forge that was cursed. It was a witchcraft to use poison that wasn't chemistry, and you most likely stirred it with a severed toe under a blood moon. You would assume that this fear would be beneficial. People did, after all, avoid you. But the truth was worse. Mobs of superstitious people don't think twice. They don't inquire. For example, they hurl stones, start fires, and yell, "Burn him before he calls lightning." People overreacted because of your reputation. When someone choked on a chicken bone or died of an untimely sickness, someone would whisper, "Perhaps it was a shadow man." It might have been him. Simply being in the same hamlet as a suspicious death might result in you being persecuted. You had to keep moving because of that, always. A priest rings a bell after too long, and 5 irate farmers brandish pitchforks as if they've been waiting for this moment all their lives. Heaven forbid you were caught in possession of anything even slightly strange. All it took to cry "sorcerer" and ignite a torch was dried herbs, odd cash, or even a foreign accent. In a society that thought monsters had human faces, you were a threat if you were too swift, too silent, or too smart. According to medieval reasoning, threats had to perish soon, ideally by burning. Oh, poison, the elegant weapon used by the assassin. Just a sip, a stagger, a sigh, and it's over. No mess, no shouting, no steel on bone. That's the theory. In actuality, poisoning someone during the Middle Ages was akin to using herbal tea and a negative attitude to win a bar brawl. To begin with, poisons weren't trustworthy. Purified cyanide and a convenient tiny tablet called fast-acting doom were not available to you. You had minerals, plants, mushrooms, and perhaps the occasional toad. Even after gathering grind and prey, the target can experience a stomach pain and become even more dedicated to his anti-Asin Guard team. No scientific measurement was made. You didn't do it exactly right. It was eyeballed by you. The aristocrat simply throws up and calls off dinner if there is too little pinch. Medieval kitchens were chaotic, and if you squeeze too much, you'll perish from exposure before the first course is served. You couldn't simply waltz in and add nightshade to the soup. You needed to bribe someone, pretend to be a cook, sneak in while no one was looking, or, worst of all, try to contaminate food that would be consumed by a dog and 3 tasters. A dog, indeed. Additionally, if your victim was a noble, they handled it like a military operation rather than merely eating meals. Everyone, from the jester to the steward, scented and tasted the meals. Even if you did it, you snuck in the poison because by the time the meal reached their plate, it had gone through more security than a royal wedding. The target actually ate it without anyone noticing. The following section was completely unpredictable. One minute, your mark is laughing at a joke, whereas others took hours or days. If they lived, guess who they would blame? Not the cook, after he clutches his stomach and demands to see his astrologer. The taster is not you, the reserved man with the twitching eyes and herbal knowledge. Thus, poisoning was ineffective. It was dangerous, sluggish, and full of factors that were all against you. If you were caught, you wouldn't die quickly. You were questioned with instruments until you admitted to poisoning the dog and the duke. You would think that someone would remember your name if you were able to alter history by overthrowing a despot, destroying a royal line, or putting an end to a political menace. No, you were a killer. Your name was therefore never intended to be remembered. You were a rumor at best, a stranger with icy eyes or a veiled figure, or the silent man who never finished his ale. The argument was actually that you might have pulled off the century's most iconic hit and still ended up as a mystery death in the official record. Your customer didn't desire a narrative. Their goal was plausible deniability. People were safer and less likely to be poisoned by their own assassin if fewer people knew who did it. So, as soon as the job was finished, your name was buried. You didn't sign your work. You didn't boast, and you didn't keep trophies if you even used a real one. And if someone did know your name, that was a loose end. You didn't exist outside of the kill moment. And forget about honor. In your line of work, loose ends had a very short shelf life. Medals for quiet were absent. If a noble desired a statue, they commissioned one for themselves. If not, they received a wooden box, an unmarked tomb, or, in the worst-case scenario, a head on a spike marked traitor. There are no stone monuments for the guy who stopped a war with a single dagger in the middle of the night. There were times when your name was only known to curse you, turning you into a warning whisper. Avoid disobeying the king. The man who did it vanished like a ghost, and you may recall what happened to Lord Ulrich. That was your legacy. Absence, not fame or fear. You were meant to disappear, not to leave any trace. And staying long enough to gain notoriety was a deadly error because heroes were remembered in the medieval era. Assassins were eliminated. So you made it through, completed the task, and even got paid. A miracle in and of itself. All you need to do now is keep your head down, stay low, and have faith that your client will fulfill their end of the bargain and protect your identity. Correctly incorrect. Because there was a rule in the world of medieval assassination that was even more sacred than not getting caught. Never trust anyone, especially the person who is paying you. Your client, whether they be a noble, a merchant, or a bishop with ambition and very loose morals, didn't hire you out of respect, but rather because they needed something terrible done, and you were the most skilled tool in the shadows. You became a liability once the task was finished. You were dangerous to them as well as to their enemies, because you knew too much about who wanted you dead, when, why, and possibly how much they were willing to pay for it. So what did they do? They either denied ever meeting you or, worse, sent someone else after you to clean up and end the contract with a sharp object other than ink. In such instances, clients would hire two assassins, one to do the task and another to murder the first one right away. No refunds, just lower risk. And it was brave of you to try to blackmail a client by threatening to expose them. That was also your last error. Because powerful individuals in the Middle Ages crushed assassins instead of negotiating with them. You might be paid and left alone if your client truly possessed a unique breed of honor. However, you would still need to presume that they were observing you from afar, with someone already honing their skills and learning your route. Even success wasn't enough to gain their trust, because, in their eyes, if you killed once, you could kill again. And nobody, not even the person who hired you, wanted to be the next one. Let's say you managed to overcome the odds and survive the murders, lies, poisonings, and betrayals. You were the secret that couldn't speak, the shadow that couldn't stay. You outlived your employers, your adversaries, and very likely your own moral compass. Assassins in the Middle Ages did not have retirement plans, so what you retire now is definitely not. There were no farewell dinners, no peaceful seaside houses, no gold coin pensions, and no appreciative murmurs. You didn't slip into a calm life. Instead, you frequently perished or disappeared. The issue was straightforward. You were never secure. You had too many names in your memory, too many secrets in your thoughts, and too much blood on your hands, even if you quit the job. People wanted you forgotten, which typically meant being buried, not retired. Even if no one pursued you, which is significant, you would still have to live in continual worry that someone that a young assassin who was keen to establish himself had recently been hired by a mysterious person who was once a threat. You have once again changed your name. You relocated to a village where nobody questioned you. You pretended to be a guard and sold herbs while pretending to have a limp. However, you didn't get enough sleep even then. You sat with your back to the door and avoided crowds. Because it still smelt like the man you won it from, you stored your dagger under the floorboards next to the coin pouch you never touched. You also couldn't trust yourself because of the damage that years of stealthy killings and hasty escapes had done to your brain. You recoiled every time the door was knocked. You stopped dreaming because it was hazardous, because you might be recognized by every stranger you meet on the road. You couldn't laugh too much. You couldn't relax, and you couldn't love. You lived as though you were a ghost masquerading as a man. The fact was that a medieval assassin had no endgame, just a gradual, icy descent into obscurity with constant movement and observation, until one day you vanished into the darkness without anyone noticing. Perhaps that was all you could hope for. By this point, you've most likely worked it out. It wasn't darkly glamorous or noble to be an assassin in the Middle Ages. Even still, it wasn't very profitable. A horde of people who wanted you dead followed your gloomy, miserable, brief career wrapped in blood-stained linen. Because you would begin with the incorrect presumptions, you wouldn't last even a day, let alone a week. You'd be slick and in charge, a whisper in the dark, but in reality, you'd be cold-blooded and just one wrong guess away from the noose. You would enter the town with your cloak tight and prepared for action, only to find that your target had relocated. The stable lad you bribed for information just sold you out for a piece of bread and a mug of ale, and the guards are inebriated yet impulsive. At the wrong moment, you would freeze, stab the incorrect person. You're no longer a shadow after being noticed by a maid who used to see your face near the chapel. The issue is you. You run, but you're not accustomed to running over medieval terrain. The unsteady cobblestones, the muck, and the ridiculously high number of straggling poultry in the roadway. A guard named Thomas, who recently got fired and is seeking a way to cope, tackles you after you slip and fall. If you survive, you then have to deal with the fallout. No future, no honor, and no allies merely arouses suspicion and the growing understanding that even in the event of success, your only hope is to die old and alone in a village that still believes in fairies while hiding behind a false identity. The assassin's life wasn't cool, so yeah, you wouldn't last. And to be honest, you shouldn't try. It was a vicious machine that ate individuals and spit out only darkness. You did not create history. Instead, you deleted yourself from it, and the only thing that awaited you in the end was silence. It provided power without tranquility, and purpose without a place in the world. And nobody would question the stillness because nobody ever recalled your presence in the first place. Prior to that, she was Macedonia's feared queen. Mertale, a Maloian princess from the untamed tribal areas of Epirus, was Olympus's name. Regardless of whether or not she was genuinely descended from Achilles, her people claimed that she was a lady who was not destined to live on the periphery of history. Myrtle was surrounded by mystery and ceremony from an early age. In addition to politics, her upbringing was influenced by prophecy, ecstasy, and a respect for the ancient gods. She wasn't the kind of princess who made tapestries and smiled. No, she was attracted to the frenetic rituals of the worship of Dionysus, where women danced barefoot in the moonlight and invoked the divine in trance, as well as the omens of serpents. Her relationship with the gods wasn't a theatrical one. It was intimate. She was more than just a worshiper. She kept sacred snakes in her apartments and even let them coil next to her in bed, according to ancient records that were probably penned by men who were both frightened and fascinated. We'll never know if this was true or just the kind of slander that strong women attract like flies, but to her supporters, it made her seem divine. It made her dangerous in the eyes of her foes. Her true might was first revealed under the eerie flicker of torchlight amid the murmurs of priestesses and the curled bodies of serpents. Not in a battlefield or throne room. She was a living oracle, a lady impacted by something more profound than politics and more enduring than steel. And she was more than simply a princess. In addition to meeting a stunning princess, Philip II of Macedon, who was cruel, smart, and notoriously lustful, met a mystery that he couldn't ignore when he traveled to the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation. Their marriage wasn't merely a political partnership. It was a clash between power and prophecy, and there were many omens from the start. Some claimed Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb, while others believed lightning hit the sky on their wedding night. It would all become folklore, but one thing is for sure: Alexander the Great was born as a result of Olympias and Philip's coupling, and she had plans to influence his fate from the moment he was born. The union of Olympia and Philip II was hardly what one could anticipate from a queen who would eventually establish an empire. It was a volatile combination of paranoia and prophecy pride from the start. Around 357 BCE, Philip, who was cruel, charming, and already collecting wives like trophies, married Olympias. She wasn't naive. Even though she was probably only a teenager, she recognized in Philip a man who shared her ambitions and who might perhaps be a divine fit for her spiritual path. Olympias, the priestess of Papyrus, entered Macedon with her head held high and her eyes already on the throne. Macedon was a realm of iron and ambition, where brothers were instantly turned into rivals, and monarchs were assassinated by cousins. From the beginning, their marriage was troubled. Despite his political prowess, Philip was not suited for monogamy. Olympias would later marry other women, frequently in alliances and always for power, but he wasn't one to remain in the background. She was known to use oracles and rites to predict her destiny and possibly Philip's. And she kept her own court and connections. Then, Alexander even was born, surrounded by heavenly drama. According to legend, Olympus dreamed that a thunderbolt had struck her womb and that her unborn child was surrounded by dancing flames without being burned. According to reports, Philip saw a vision of a real lion closing his wife's womb. They acted as though Alexander was meant to control not just a kingdom, but the entire world, regardless of whether they believed or made up these visions. However, even as the child was hailed, the royal marriage's flaws grew. Olympus harbored animosity toward Philip's previous spouses, particularly his later married Macedonian wife, Cleopatra Eurydice. This was not only a household matter, it posed a danger. Since Cleopatra was born in Macedonia, the local nobility would view any son she had as being more pure. Olympia plainly saw it as a direct danger to Alexander's future. She would utilize every snake dream ritual and whisper she possessed to ensure that her son was not just remembered, but also the palace was more than simply a place of residence. It was a battlefield. She had changed from being Myrtle. No one would ascend to her son's throne without incurring her wrath, because she was now Olympus. The Macedonian palace in Pella had devolved into a battlefield of covert taunts, political scheming, and acrimonious rivalries by the time Alexander was a teenager. Crowned because Olympus fought not only for power, but also for her own existence. Although she was aware that there were many snakes in the court, she was the one who taught them how to bite. With his increased campaigning, drinking, and, worst of all, listening to his Macedonian advisors, Philip II had started to turn away from her. His marriage to a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with the Cleopatra of Egypt, was the last straw. This Cleopatra was born in Macedonia, and one of Philip's most important generals was her uncle, Attalus. It was more than simply treachery to Olympias. The marriage ceremony was a catastrophe, and it was declared war. During the feast, Attalus made fun of Olympus and Alexander while intoxicated, casting doubt on the validity of Alexander's birth. Olympus preferred to say that it was meant as an insult, but Olympia grabbed the tail. Was he actually Philip's kid or the child of a god? Let them mutter that her son was rendered untouchable after being touched by Zeus. Macedon completely fled to Apros as Alexander stormed out of the feast, but her banishment was a calculated move rather than a failure. She remained a princess in her native country. She didn't need to be physically present to be harmful. She could gather support, whisper in ears, and watch as Philip's palace started to decay from the inside out. The shock wave then arrived. As Philip prepared to invade Persia, he was slain at his daughter's wedding. He was about to declare himself not only the king of Macedon, but also the emperor of the entire globe. The identical query reverberated through each marble hallway and hall illuminated by torches. Was it done by whom? Was the act committed by Pausanias, the betrayed bodyguard, the product of royal intrigue, Alexander himself, or Olympus, who no one could prove? Many people believed it, but no one dared. After all, Cleopatra Eurydice and her infant son died within a few days, murdered, according to some, by Olympus herself. The serpent had returned to the palace, and her offspring was now unhindered by anything. Olympias took action after Philip passed away, and Macedon was either in mourning or confused. She acted quickly, brutally, and decisively, as others frantically tried to comprehend the turmoil. The young Macedonian queen and competing wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, was first removed. According to terrifying reports, Olympus humiliated her in public and used her death as a symbol. Some claim that after witnessing the murder of her infant daughter, Cleopatra was compelled to hang herself. Others assert that the infant was thrown onto a funeral procession by Olympus. Everyone agrees that there was no mercy displayed. Olympia recognized that mercy is a liability in a royal palace, something that many mothers in ancient courts refused to embrace. Olympias was done playing defense, and a rival child, no matter how minor, may cause a future conflict. Now that Cleopatra and her lineage were exterminated, she could focus on gaining Alexander's crown. Don't be duped, though. Her adolescent son, who had already had Aristotelian training, was proclaimed king with little protest. It was made feasible by more than just his charm or his father's legacy. It was Mount Olympus. She was not only safeguarding her son's ascent, she was orchestrating it. Alexander himself wasn't always in agreement. He allegedly disapproved of the brutality against Cleopatra's family. She understood which generals to scare, which nobles to flatter, and which adversaries to subtly remove. He didn't stop it, though, for he knew in his heart what Olympias had always known. Bloodlines were both a boon and a bane in Macedonia, where power required blood. Olympias started to step back from public life a little once her son became king, but this was hardly retirement. She only changed her style from open attacks to influence that was whispered. She stayed behind while Alexander was ready to begin his conquest of Persia, not as a submissive queen mother, but as the spiritual protector of his fate. She gave him holy artifacts, conferred with oracles, and performed ceremonies for him on his behalf to go to Olympus. Her son's mission was not merely military, it was divine. Alexander was carrying out prophecy, not going to war, and no competing Macedonian, Persian, or other force could stop that divine plan, as long as she was alive. After cleaning the palace and crowning her son, she would now stand watch over his empire from behind the curtain, her teeth bared. Olympus stayed behind in Macedon, while Alexander marched east to conquer the known world. A monarch without a throne, yet with authority. She reigned in every way except name, despite her official status as Queen Mother. Olympus refused to be marginalized. Even though Antipater, one of Alexander's trusted generals, was officially given the regency, she frequently warned and occasionally reprimanded her son in letters. These were political briefings, filled with vitriol and oracles, not the tender letters of a loving mother. And Alexander, who was thousands of miles away, read every word. Nobody else dared to speak to him about his fascination with Persian customs, his choice of wives, or his flirtation with calling himself a god. But Olympias never shied away from speaking as a mother or a priestess of divine will. She reminded him of his true enemies, and questioned the loyalty of his companions. Olympia used her position, her religious authority, and her familial connections to incite opposition against Antipater, who grew increasingly resentful back in Macedon. She had influence among the aristocracy and in Epirus, Thessaly, and she could spread rumors like wildfire. With Olympus, a whisper could be more deadly than a sword. Meanwhile, her letters to Alexander became more urgent. She cautioned him about Antipat's desire to portray him as a second-class citizen. Whether she really thought Philip was going to betray and usurp, or whether she was just afraid of losing control, she persisted in pressuring her son to act Alexander, even though he hesitated, since he needed Antipater to maintain order in Greece while he was fighting in Asia. As a result, the distance between the mother and the general grew as Olympia watched. She waited. She hadn't fought in a palace for years to be dominated by an elderly soldier, so behind her religious robes and mother concern, she was becoming impatient. Olympia witnessed the formation of fissures as Alexander's dominion extended from the Aegean to India. He was straying from his mother and the gods who created him, taking on too much and putting too much confidence in outside counsel. She thought that she and divine favor were the reasons behind his conquests, and if he forgot it, Olympus was able to remind kings of their true identities, even if the king was her own son. Macedon did not receive the news of Alexander's death in Babylon with great fanfare in 323 BCE. Like a dagger, it came. For Olympus, the fall of a universe she had spent decades creating was more devastating than the death of a son. The heavenly storm that she had foreseen and unleashed had vanished, leaving behind nothing but pandemonium and no clear air. His so-called heirs were already splitting up the powerful dominion he had carved out like jackals around a dead body. Antipater had no affection for Olympus and continued to rule Macedonia and Greece. Make her daughter Cleopatra's life worse, Olympia knew what was coming, as opposing generals courted Alexander's sister for marriage, each attempting to gain the throne through her lineage. There was no chance of a civil war. She would have to act once more. But she didn't have Alexander anymore, so it was inevitable. Instead, she possessed his lineage. Alexander IV, his infant son, born to Roxana, the Bactrian princess, was at risk, since Alexander had married Roxana while she was still in Macedon. The boy was even more so when Olympus realized that the baby was now the final, authentic remnant of her son's legacy, making him both a target and a weapon. She joined forces with Roxana and the boy in order to defend them and assert her own claim to the child's birthright in the political sphere. However, things were changing. The generals, who had previously bowed to Alexander, had no desire to bow down to his mother or widow. Instead, they had armies, aspirations, and resentments. Olympus didn't recoil. She had encountered monarchs, traitors, and snakes. She planned because she wouldn't be frightened by a few warlords wearing crowns and spears that had been stolen. She waited. She saw Antipater pass away and be succeeded by his son, Cassander, a man who had little patience for the old queen's antics and had ice in his veins. The collision between these two forces was inevitable. Alexander's snake mother and the icy user who wanted her buried had vanished, but his shadow continued to move, and Olympus remained curled up inside it, poised to attack. Olympia made her most daring action years after Alexander's death, as his empire collapsed into civil strife. However, she returned to Macedon as a political force of divine wrath, rather than a mourning mother. They had broken the regency. Roxana and young Alexander IV were essentially imprisoned, while Cassandra, the son of her former adversary Antippa, was assuming power. Olympia realized that her grandchild would disappear like a shadow at nightfall if she did nothing. She therefore agreed with Polyperchon, an elderly general who still had a glimmer of genuine power, that Olympus would return to rule rather than to beg. Using Polypon's with support, she led an army into Macedonia, and as soon as her feet touched the ground, everything changed. Towns opened their gates, soldiers joined her cause. Despite her advanced age, Olympia's name still rocked the earth, and even some of her former adversaries hesitated before she exacted her revenge. She pursued Cassander's loyalists one by one, and she ordered the execution of Philip III, Aradus Alexander's mentally challenged half-brother and puppet monarch, after she had finally apprehended him. Some stories claim that his wife Eurydice was taken prisoner and offered the chance to commit suicide. Olympus strangled her after she refused. Olympus theatrically orchestrated the situation as if it were a goddess administering justice, but it was actually cruelty, wrapped in regal decorum. Her message was clear. Everyone else was a pretender, and only Alexander's lineage had the right to reign. Olympia briefly seized control of the country. She had brought the dynasty back. She was vengeful for betrayals. She had shown Macedon what it looked like for a woman with nothing left to lose, to wield royal power. But in Macedon, power was like fire in dry grass. Furthermore, Cassander continued to wait and calculate outside. He came back with a bang. His army outweighed hers, and his malice was colder, and his resources were deeper. Her supporters started to turn against her once Polyperon's power declined. Olympus, now alone in the Pydna castle, watched as her foes closed in after the tide shifted. She had struck a match. Since Macedon had burned, there was a lot of smoke, and her adversaries were at the gates. Once the most feared woman in antiquity, Olympus was now besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna, cut off from everyone else and encircled by Cassandra's army, which had come to complete the task his father had begun. However, Olympus did not beg or plead. Instead, she endured the siege for almost a year, like a statue carved from divine wrath. Food ran out, disease spread, and the allies disappeared. However, she continued to have the same unwavering presence that had previously shook kings inside the fortress walls. Cassandra, who was always wary and hesitant because he understood that slaying Olympus was perilous, carried a myth around her like armor until the very end. Not as a prisoner, but as the mother of a god. She was still Alexander the Great's mother. He offered her refuge, since it could appear blasphemous to strike her down. He suggested that if she surrendered, her life would be saved. Olympia was wiser. Too many royal promises had turned to ash, in her opinion. However, hunger was no longer merely an inconvenience. Death was involved. Her garrison shattered. Her supporters gave up, and Olympias, who remained steadfast until the very end, was turned up to her adversaries. It would have been too easy and too kind of Cassandra to kill her himself. Rather, he handed her up to the relatives of the people she had put to death during her brief reign of power. Let them determine her destiny. The catch is that they sentenced her to death. Olympia stood tall and royal, her eyes motionless and fixed on the executioners like an oracle gazing through smoke, and no one dared to strike the first blow. They were Macedonians who had grown up learning about her snakes, visions, and ceremonies. They had once praised her son as a living god. But now, she was a weak old woman shrouded in myth, and no man had the guts to brandish his sword. Cassandra sent other foreigners and outsiders who had no recollection of her authority, just instructions to obey. And so, Olympus was ultimately brought down in silence, rather than with a ceremony or dignity. Even in death, Olympus cast a shadow, and history would never forget the Snake Queen. Her passing signaled the end of Alexander's lineage in any significant authority, and it also extinguished the last remnant of an empire built on heavenly ambition. However, history is peculiar in that it does not always reward those who die in silk sheets. Olympus died in the dust, defenseless, abandoned, and executed by the very people she had controlled, rather than on a throne. Olympus was never intended for a peaceful past, and occasionally it honors those who died hissing. Throughout her life, she had used prophecy as a shield and motherhood as a sword. She was not only Alexander the Great's mother, she was also a key figure in his ascent to power. The myth of the heavenly child would not exist without her. No rites that talk about lions and thunderbolts. There was no brutal elimination of competitors that made room for a young monarch to dominate the planet. Not only did Olympus create an empire, but she also used her claws to protect it. Olympia, however, stands out even amid the most brutal dynasties of antiquity. Unlike Cleopatra, she did not lead armies in the field or ride into combat like Boadicea. Her battleground was more subdued and icy. There were poison goblets everywhere. Political unions, oracles, and priestesses. She made others think her son was holy, and she may have even believed it herself. Her opponents called her a murderer, a witch, and a manipulator, and they weren't mistaken. She knew the power of fear, but more significantly, she knew the power of belief. Olympia possessed all of those qualities and more. She was raised in a harsh environment that valued cunning above kindness, and she discovered early on that mercy was a luxury that queens could not afford. She was demonized and mythologized in the centuries that followed. She was referred to be a criminal by some and a visionary by others, but neither ancient nor modern historians could dismiss her as unimportant. Perhaps that's where she belonged, haunting Alexander's legacy like a phantom, always in the background, always just behind the curtain. The woman who wrapped herself in prophecy, outlived gods, and slept next to snakes, but not as a sad mother or a footnote in a king's tale, but as a story in her own right. Long ago, Olympia's bones fell to dust. However, her legend lives on in all stories about vicious queens. She remains there, coiled in the dark, waiting in every whisper of blood-born destiny and in every myth-based kingdom. Only a few miles south of the contemporary city of Herakleion, on the sun-kissed island of Crete, is a ruin that seems more like a dream than a genuine location. Stone hallways wind in every direction. Rooms twist and reverse themselves. No one is led by staircases. This location is Knossos, the center of Minoan civilization, and the purported source of one of the most persistent stories in human history, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before there was a legend, there was a palace. Even now, it's easy to lose your sense of direction. A palace that is unique. Nos was more than simply a royal residence. It was a metropolis, all under one roof, spanning almost 150,000 square feet, and with more than 1,000 rooms. It was constructed around 1900 BCE and grew over the course of centuries. It was an architectural masterpiece with light wells, stores, periodicals, shrines, workshops, and possibly the first flushing toilets in history. It also had multi-story dwellings with flowing water and a complex air circulation system. To contemporary archaeologists, it appears to be well-organized chaos. It was likely magical to ancient visitors. Arthur Evans, a British archaeologist, was the one who popularized Nos. After excavating the site in the early 1900s, Evans was immediately persuaded that this was where the Greek labyrinth story originated. The architecture was highly symbolic. The layout was confusing, and everywhere he looked, he saw bull patterns carved into stone or painted on walls, or fashioned into little golden trinkets. After all, the Minoans revered the bull. Whether or not Minos was real, his reputation became inextricably linked to the ruins, and Evans even went so far as to name the civilization after the legendary ruler. Here's the twist, though. No one has discovered a real labyrinth. No jail cells, no half-man monster, no underground labyrinth. Instead, we have something much more enigmatic. The boundaries between myth and history get increasingly hazy the further you walk through a city that is purposefully built with loops, wings, and layers. The issue still stands. Did the Minotaur originate from these walls, or was the palace itself the source of the monster? The monster may not readily reveal its solutions, but it excels at forcing us to think critically. The tale is as well known as the ruin, which depicts a hideous half-bull, half-man locked in a maze so intricate that no one who enters ever finds their way out. Thanks to a ball of thread and Princess Ariadne's guile, only Theseus, the Athenian hero, was able to defeat the beast and make his getaway. However, the origin of this tale and the reason for a labyrinth. According to the ancient myths, King Minos was the strong Cree king who required 7 sons and 7 females as a yearly payment from Athens. The Minotaur, a creature created out of shame and divine wrath, was fed these poor souls. The Minotaur, imprisoned in an underground labyrinth, represented the sinister side of power, something barbaric concealed underneath majesty. Cree was long regarded by the ancient Greeks as a place of luxury, mystery, and terror. The Minoans who lived there were viewed as both sophisticated and foreign. Their palaces were unlike anything on the continent. Their artwork featured weird gods, and their rites involving bulloping. Nos would have seemed like a different planet to a Greek visitor in 1000 BCE. In Minoan culture, the bull itself was considered sacrosanct. In ceremonial demonstrations, young men and women are depicted in frescoes leaping over charging bulls. On altars and rooftops, stylized bull horns are used as horns of consecration. The elements of a legend start to come together when you combine this with a palace that feels like a maze. However, other academics think the story recalls Cretan ascendancy over the Ion, a period when Athens really did honor a stronger alien power. What if the Minier wasn't just a monster? The labyrinth can represent weaker states' political captivity. Others contend it's more psychological, while others see the Minotaur as the unadulterated, terrible force that underpinned Minoan rule. The tale is still entangled with Nous. The labyrinth represents the unconscious mind. The Minotaur represents our inner desires. And Theseus, the hero, fearlessly ventures into the dark with only the thread of memory for guidance. The palace is the closest thing to a true maze that we have ever discovered. No Ariadne, no monster, but maybe something more profound. History was begging to become myth, not only a tale reverberating through time. One of the first highly developed communities in Europe was the Minoan civilization, which existed long before Sparta sharpened its spears or Athens reared its marble temples. At the center of their authority was Knossos, a palace that served as a center of culture, ritual, and the economy, in addition to being a residence for kings. They dominated not by conquest, but by trade, art, and what appears to be an almost mystical command of construction. The Minoans were prosperous between 2600 and 400 BCE. They established a vast trading network based on Crete that extended to Egypt, the Levant, Mesopotamia, and even the far reaches of Spain. Like stealthy darts, their ships sliced through the Mediterranean, delivering luxury commodities, saffron ceramics, and bronze. They cultivated relationships rather than large armies, and their wealth came from more than just guns. The most remarkable aspect of Minoan civilization is how distinct it was from those of their later Greek descendants. Instead of glorifying conflict or divine retribution, their artwork praised nature, animals, and the fluidity of human movement. Dolphins, sportsmen, and dancers in a fresco performance jumping over bulls. They even have distinct goddesses, strong, bare-breasted figures, frequently carrying snakes as protection or fertility transformation symbols. Konos, a complex in a lush valley rather than a fortress on a hill, was at the center of it all. Its lack of substantial defensive walls suggests that the Minoans either felt safe on their island or were powerful enough to not need security. They had architectural confidence. Despite their intelligence, the Minoans left no deciphered written documents, despite their multi-story buildings, colonized courtyards, and sophisticated plumbing systems, which suggested a culture far ahead of its time. Their main script is linear. We don't know what they called themselves, what their rulers thought, what prayers they said, or what actually transpired inside the walls of Nous, and A is still unreadable today. Their ruins are all that we have. Greek stories echoed their art and influence, which the Mycenaeans later acquired. Nous wasn't just a structure, it was the beating heart of a civilization that briefly shone like sunlight on the Aegean before disappearing, though some claim their echo can still be heard wandering the maze. Minoans weren't simply builders of palaces, they were architects of mystery. To traverse Knossos is to traverse time. Layered, perplexing, lovely moment. The design is what overwhelms you, not just the scale. Rooms lead to other rooms. Corridors divide and disappear. Light wells pierce the center of the structure. Stairs might abruptly emerge onto sunny courtyards or spiral into shadows. Nothing travels straight forward. Why ancient visitors would have mumbled labyrinth is easy to understand. Covering an estimated 150,000 square feet, the complex had over 1,000 chambers, some small and some large. Knossos was more than just a palace, it was a living being. These were not rooms thrown together. Rather, they were purpose-built workshops, storage areas, shrines, residences and throne rooms grouped around a big central courtyard that would have been the site of bulling rituals or public festivities. The palace was constructed using artificial terraces and natural slopes on several levels, reaching up to 4 or 5 stories in some areas. You would need a thread like Theseus or memory instinct to move around it without getting lost. However, beneath all of this seeming disorder lies a tremendous intelligence. The Manoans were adept at using air shafts and open stairwells for passive ventilation, cooling rooms. They had toilets that flushed long before Rome made it popular, and they used clay pipes to channel rainfall. The throne room, so named because of the alabaster chair set into the wall and the benches on either side, is one of the most recognizable spaces. It is surrounded with frescoes of the mythical protectors of Griffin. Nobody is positive if this was a sacred court, a goddess chamber, or the seat of a priest monarch. Additionally, the walls speak color. Dolphins swimming above bathtubs are shown in a vibrant fresco. Ladies with naked chests wearing sophisticated flounced skirts. Young people jumping bulls in midair. The artwork wasn't merely ornamentation. It was a matter of identification. Earth and sea are closely related to fluid nature. However, Nos starts to become more confused the further you go. Certain sections appear purposefully complicated, as if they were meant to be confusing. Perhaps that is where the legend of the labyrinth originated. It was a castle that felt alive, not a jail for monsters. No barred doors, no fabled animals. A structure that evoked awe, ceremony, and a hint of fear. It was merely designed to make you wonder where you were and what might be around the corner. Nos was a place of worship and an architectural manifestation of the Minoan spirit, rich in ritual myth and heavenly mystery, rather than merely a royal house or administrative hub. The spiritual realm of Kenosis is more subtly woven into the structure itself than in later Greek temples, which have marble shrines to Athena and imposing columns to Zeus. Shrines conceal themselves in nooks. Like holy sentinels, pillars rise. On altars and rooftops, stylized carved symbols of horns can be seen. The bull symbol is prevalent everywhere you look, implying a strong bond between reverence for this animal and the natural world. The bull was celebrated by the Minoans, who didn't appear to be afraid of it. The well-known bull leaping fresco in Nos may represent a religious rite in addition to being a work of sports art. It was sacred theater, either a sacrifice to the gods or a symbolic victory over chaos, with young men and women leaping over a charging bull caught in a dance of elegance and peril. Among the most famous Minoan relics are the snake goddess sculptures, which were found in storerooms beneath the palace. These powerful figures are not subservient idols. Rather, they are protectors of the fertility of the home, and possibly life itself. They have bare-breasted arms uplifted, and serpents coiled in their hands or around their body. Snakes represented mystery, regeneration, and renewal to the Minoans, both terrestrial and subterranean creatures. Together with the fresco, horns, altars, and winding hallways, the entire complex starts to feel like a ritual machine, a building designed not only for survival, but also for establishing a connection with the divine. The rooms where these items were discovered allude to domestic shrines or ritual spaces, quiet, sacred corners tucked away among the palace's busy heart. Since the palace was formerly a temple, Nos does not have a single temple, a site where myth was architecture, where a corridor could become a conduit to the gods. and where every echo in the stone chambers may have once been a muttered prayer. Its layout, art, and design were all a part of a spiritual worldview where boundaries between sacred and secular didn't exist. Nos did more than simply house people. It contained gods. Nos was a shining example of wealth, creativity, and cultural refinement for ages. But then something unexpected happened that no one can quite understand. The palace had been abandoned by 1400 BCE. The frescoes had been allowed to deteriorate, and the Minoan civilization that had once dominated the seas had disappeared like a cloud over the Iron. Theories of what transpired are numerous. Some attribute this to nature. Around 1600 BCE, one of the biggest explosions in human history occurred on the volcanic island of Thera, which is now Santorini. The blow was so enormous that it probably triggered tsunamis that devastated farms and ports along the northern coast of Sit. It's possible that ash clouds obscured the light, strangling crops and altering the environment. Although Knossos wasn't destroyed right away, the eruption's repercussions might have rocked the city's foundations politically, economically, and spiritually. Others turned to war. The growing strength of the Mycenaeans on the Greek mainland about 1450 BCE-CE might have exploited Minoan vulnerability. According to archaeological evidence, Nos was temporarily populated again, although the society had evolved. The artwork became more martial Linear A, and Mycenaean scribes began using Linear B in place of the Minoan script. Once teeming with bull dancers and snake goddesses, the palace now spoke in a foreign language. According to other academics, the Mycenaeans progressively assimilated the island rather than invading it all at once. Trade comes first, followed by influence, and eventually rule. Others contend that the failure of the elite, political instability, social unrest, or internal disintegration may have played an equal role. However, it's remarkable how little violence can be seen in the remains. No burnt skeletons or evidence of mass murder are present. Nos fell with a murmur rather than a scream. The enormous palatial system just ceased to exist. The rooms fell silent. After the ceremonies concluded, nature gradually returned. Perhaps this is appropriate, since what killed Konos wasn't merely an eruption or invasion. By the time Homer sang of the Cree in his epics, Nos was already an ancient myth, a memory entangled in tales of kings, monsters, and labyrinths. It was time for everything magnificent, no matter how lovely, eventually crumbles under the weight of new empires. However, the bones are still there, and if you listen carefully, the maze beneath the earth continues to hum. Knossos was buried beneath the Cretan soil for thousands of years. Another stone mound, its name forgotten, its stories warped, its walls engulfed by dust and olive groves. That is, until a man named Sir Arthur Evans made the decision to pursue a legend. Furthermore, he reimagined Knossos, rather than merely rediscovering it. The land covering the ancient ruins was bought in 1900 by Evans, a British archaeologist with a flair for theatre and a strong interest in mythology. Strange seals and relics had been discovered by local farmers, suggesting that something massive was beneath their feet. Evans got to work. What he discovered would permanently alter Iron history. He discovered a mansion so enormous, intricate, and sophisticated but he was certain it was the legendary residence of King Minos. The site's fresco, horns, and overall architectural oddity, everything in his thinking pointed to the labyrinth. Evans was more than simply an archaeologist. He was also a storyteller, and occasionally a contentious one. He christened the Konos builders the Manowans, in honor of Minos. He repaired portions of the palace with reinforced concrete, reconstructed frescoes, and interpreted symbols, moves that have garnered both praise and criticism. Others refer to it as vandalism, while others call it visionary, because what you see at Knossos today is a combination of Edwardian fantasy and old ruin. Evans did more than just unearth stone, though. He brought Knossos back to life and gave Europe a glimpse of a Bronze Age world that was much older than classical Greece. It was a civilization of art, mystery, and maritime elegance. Additionally, he unearthed the script that had not yet been deciphered, raising new questions about language literacy and the boundaries of our historical understanding. He brought a myth back to life and made historians face the reality that lies behind the myth of the labyrinth. A palace that resembled a maze, a civilization that vanished into obscurity, and a man who peeled back the earth to uncover a tale that was stranger and more exquisite than he had ever dreamed. Knos had slept for 3 millennia. It was awakened when Evans rang the bell. When you walk through Knossos, you're experiencing more than simply building. You're experiencing a symbolic language. There are fresco carvings and motifs everywhere. However, we were not left a Rosetta Stone by the Manowans. Their main script is linear. A is still unsolved. Therefore, we must observe their thoughts, disguised in patterns and painted upon plaster, rather than interpreting them. What specifically were they attempting to convey when they said that Knossos' art was unique among the ancient world? There are no rows of rulers, battle-hardened heroes, or fixation with war. Rather, we witness sacred bulls, dolphins, lilies, and birds in flight. Humans are elegant beings who frequently dance or carry out rituals. There is beauty and rhythm even in circumstances that imply peril. The Manowans celebrated life cycles and perhaps cosmic order, rather than documenting triumphs. However, the double axe, or labrys, is the most recognizable emblem. Found on frescoes and even carved into stones in chapels all across Knos. The double axe is said to be a religious symbol that may be connected to celestial cycles or female deity. According to others, the name labyrinth itself may have come from the word labes, meaning that the labyrinth is a dwelling of the double axe rather than a trap or a maze. Then there are the consecration horns, which are stylized bull horns that are positioned on altars and upper walls. These might have used as religious markers to distinguish between holy and secular areas. It is evident that the animal had profound spiritual significance when combined with the frequent representations of bulls and bull-apping customs. No one can agree on whether the bull symbolized a divine presence, fertility, turmoil, or nature. Even the Knos layout could have symbolic significance. According to some archaeologists, it was constructed to reflect seasonal or cosmic patterns in addition to its intended use. Instead of being a real jail, its twisting hallways and nestled rooms can symbolize a journey through life and death via the underworld, a spiritual labyrinth. However, in the absence of a decoded script, every thought straddles the boundary between imagination and understanding. Talking with symbols rather than tales, therefore, it is up to us to interpret Knos' claims that we can hear the rhythms. The pictures are there, but the message is elusive, like a thread unraveling into myth. Nos is a wreck, yes, yet it feels alive. If you go through its hallways today, you'll feel a hum just beneath the surface. Not ghosts or gods, but the echoes of myths, lives, and unanswerable questions. Nos still traps us in its labyrinth thousands of years after it fell. Visitors explore its corridors, researchers search for clues, and authors create new stories based on its shadow. Although the Minotaur is a myth, the labyrinth's atmosphere is genuine. Who decided Nos is unknown to us? The names of its kings, queens, and priests are unknown to us, as are the laws they lived by and the prayers they muttered. But we do know that they revered nature, loved beauty, and understood the importance of striking a balance between art and architecture, between ritual and reality, and that they were the first. Knossos existed before the Parthenon, before Rome, before the Persian palaces or the Hebrew temples. A city that doubled as a palace, a temple that doubled as a city, a temple that might have served as a narrative, because that might be the true nature of the labyrinth. It is a story etched in stone, a fable in architectural form, rather than a jail or a conundrum. It was the confusion of its passageways, the devotion of its bull ceremonies, and the awe it created in those who attempted to make sense of it, that gave rise to the legend of the Minotaur. We transformed it into archaeology, whereas the Greeks made it into a narrative. However, Nos has fundamentally always been both, even while we may now explore its ruins in the daylight, take pictures, create maps, and even recreate its fresco. The mystery remains. The distinction between mythology and reality continues to glimmer like heat on stone. Perhaps Knossos persists because it doesn't provide us with all the answers. Nos, ancient, tangled, half-remembered, isn't just a location on a map. It's a question that takes us deeper with each step. And like Theseus, we're all still following the thread. It serves as a reminder that sometimes history isn't meant to be solved. Rather, it's meant to be felt. The first rams were portable. The battering ram changed over time as engineers discovered that mounting it inside a wheeled frame, frequently with a roof to protect the crew from arrows and boiling oil, transformed it from a tool into a weapon of terror. Previously, teams of soldiers would simply lift a tree trunk and smash it against enemy defenses, like crazy lumberjacks. Rams were transformed into psychological weapons by the Assyrians, who were experts of siege warfare. Because their siege towers incorporated archer platforms and rams, defenders were always under fire while a city's gates were being destroyed. As if they were slow-moving gods of destruction, relief carvings from Nineveh depict rams with pointy iron tips rolling up to the gates of rebellious cities. Additionally, they were destroying more than just the front door. Rams were frequently employed to penetrate wall weaknesses, destroy watchtowers, or completely collapse gates. One thing was clear from their presence: give up, or watch your fortifications fall apart like stale bread. They were refined by the Greeks. They were refined by the Romans. Roman engineers constructed large siege shelters with rams, known as aries in Latin, hung from chains or ropes. The rhythm of their swinging beam was described as sounding like thunder rolling across stone, and some were so large that they required dozens of men to operate. Nevertheless, despite their overwhelming power, working as a team was crucial while battering rams. Operators have to protect the sink from burning projectiles and maintain the ram swinging. A stopped ram was a dead ram. Stones and other noxious materials were thrown from above. However, once a battering ram got rolling, it was impossible to halt. Human masonry versus wooden muscle. It was the first time engineers had used old physics as a weapon to make walls cry. The tactician was the catapult, if the battering ram was the brute. In the area where rams destroyed close-up catapults, distant attacks launched not just stones, but also fear. They were the first actual pieces of artillery in military history, and by using physics as a weapon, in ways that the adversary found almost miraculous, they transformed siege warfare. The Greek world was the first to produce catapults. In the 4th century BCE, created by bright brains who wished to give combat more range and momentum, a dictator with a penchant for extreme brutality, Dionysius I of Syracuse, ordered the first torsion-powered catapults, which used twisted bundles of hair, or senway, as tension springs. These were precision tools of siege terror, not huge slingshots. Their mechanics were brilliant. Engineers discovered that they could store vast amounts of potential energy by tightly twisting ropes, which were frequently constructed of animal senway. When this force was released, it could launch stones, javelins, or even blazing projectiles hundreds of meters. The two primary varieties rapidly changed: the stone-throwing catapult, which threw boulders over walls or straight at fortifications, and the ballista, which fired enormous bolts like a huge crossbow. Then came the Roman engineers, who were always able to improve on Greek ideas. They created portable siege engines for professional armies that could be disassembled, put onto carts, and reassembled on location. Certain Roman catapults were capable of blasting through wooden gates with their amazing 60-pound stone-firing capabilities, battlements, and sometimes unfortunate soldiers. Ancient generals used catapults to convey messages and occasionally to literally launch corpses over walls to spread terror and illness. Catapults were not only about destruction, they were also about show. To lower morale, severed heads were thrown into besieged cities. An early instance of biological warfare involved the firing of infected bodies into enemy territory. However, catapults had drawbacks. They needed experienced workers and were heavy, and poor terrain may make them unusable. However, when correctly positioned, they could safely hammer a city into submission. Cities knew for the first time in history that their sturdy stone walls needed to withstand more than just a ram. They also needed to survive the skies, because suddenly destruction was flying. The trebuchet was magnificent if the catapult was ingenious, tall, creaky, and frightful. It was without a doubt the dominant force in medieval siege warfare. It was more than simply a weapon when it first came on the battlefield. It was a declaration that your walls mean nothing. The trebuchet was gravity-dependent, in contrast to its tension-powered brethren. Its basic idea was a long, swinging arm on a strong frame with a sling on one end and a heavy counterweight on the other. Lift the weight, let it fall, and the arm would whip around, launching the sling and its lethal payload over enemy defenses in a high arc. It was terrible, precisely expected, and controlled destruction. early Chinese traction models from as early as the 4th century BCE, when manpower took the role of counterweights, are where the trebuchet got its start. However, the counterweight trebuchet, which would revolutionize siege warfare in both Europe and the Islamic world, first appeared in the 12th century, maybe through Muslim or Byzantine middlemen. As soon as Europe acquired the design, it quickly expanded throughout castles and crusades. The strength was astounding. 300-pound projectiles may be launched over 300 meters by a well-constructed trebuchet. Towers would be struck with furniture-sized stones that would crush walls or destroy enemy morale. However, the arc was where the true magic was. Trebuchets, as opposed to catapults, could skillfully launch projectiles over walls. This indicated that they weren't merely destroying defenses, they were also striking the inside of supply warehouses, barracks, and courtyards. Trebuchets threw everything at the defenders, including sick animals, burning pitch pans of lime, and even insults or messages wrapped in pebbles. According to one version, Warwolf had a trebuchet so large that the enemy gave up before it was ever fired during the siege of Stirling Castle in Scotland. In order to test the mechanism, the king declined to accept the surrender. Despite its deadly power, the trebuchet was slow. It required expert engineers and took hours to manufacture and minutes to reload. It is still the only siege weapon that combines psychological horror with range force. Cities held their breath when the counterweight fell, resembling the medieval equivalent of a slow-motion hammer from the sky. While battering rams and distant catapults destroyed the gates, siege towers adopted a more direct strategy, rolling straight up to the enemy's front door and dropping off armed intruders. Imagine an archers and spearmen battling a fire in a wooden skyscraper on wheels that is covered in wet hides. When one of these began to thunder toward your city walls, you knew that the real battle was about to start. Siege towers weren't subtle. When used properly, they were big, bold, and terrifyingly effective. They were the ancient equivalent of an armored personnel carrier and a mobile fortress combined. The Greeks, particularly the Hellenistic nations, were the ones who carried the design to its most dramatic extremes, while the Assyrians may have been among the first to use them in the 9th century BCE. The 9-story tower known as the Helpolis, or Taker of Cities, was constructed by the Macedonian general Demetrius during the siege of Troy in 305 BCE. It stood more than 100 feet tall, with iron-plated catapults, and was pushed by thousands of warriors. It also broke under its own weight, but the ambition was unrivaled. The reasoning behind siege towers was straightforward. Walls only function when you are unable to overcome them. By providing a higher platform from which attackers might descend into the battlements, avoiding gates and climbing ladders, siege towers lost that advantage. While soldiers on the lower levels readied themselves to board, archers on the upper deck could shower death down on defenders. Yet these towers weren't unbeatable. They were great targets for defenders using fire arrows to roll stones or even sabotage terrain because they were slow and susceptible to mud. To prevent a tower from approaching, astute defenders would use floodmows, ditches, or counterscarp fortifications, which are auxiliary inner walls. Nevertheless, they produced amazing stuff when they were at work. A wall breach was one thing, but when enemy soldiers suddenly swarmed your own rampart, it was anarchy. Siege towers made height both a strength and a weakness, changing the battlefield from a horizontal struggle for supremacy to a vertical one. It was time for hand-to-hand hell, and there was no going back once the gangplank fell from a siege tower to the city walls. While trebuchets flew and rams smashed, some of the most destructive siege methods took place underground, in silence. The grim art of destroying a city by eliminating the ground it stood on was known as siege tunneling or sapping. The concept was literally age-old and incredibly successful. Dig under the enemy's wall, use wooden supports to hold it up, and then light the supports on fire. The tunnel collapsed, taking the wall's base with it when the timbers burned away. Your city stood firm for a while. Then, like stale bread, a huge portion of the outside wall fell apart. This approach didn't seem very impressive. The slow, unseen death of fortress warfare was digging, not loud engines or deafening missiles. Early iterations were used by the Assyrians, but the Greeks, Persians, and later medieval European armies perfected the method. The Spartans tried to tunnel beneath the walls during the siege of Plataea in 429 BCE, but the defenders dug counter-tunnels and stopped them in their tracks, turning the ground into a nightmare for knife fights. This defensive strategy, which came to be known as countermining, gave siege warfare a spooky touch. Imagine soldiers searching for the sound of enemy picks while excavating hundreds of feet below the surface in complete darkness. When they heard tapping, they would rush to stop it, which frequently led to violent, cramped confrontations fought with knives and shovels under torchlight. There was only horror, suffocation, and dirt. No glory. But when undermining efforts were carried out, the outcomes were disastrous. During the siege of Rochester Castle in England in 1212, King John's soldiers, trapped beneath the southern wall, filled the mine with pig fat and set it on fire. This is one of the most notorious instances. The entire tower above was brought down as the supports gave way. The defenders were taken aback and quickly gave up. By the 13th century, siege engineers were experts at spotting unstable foundations, assessing the behavior of the soil, and predicting collapses with terrifying accuracy. They were a combination of geologists and demolitionists, and even though tunneling took a lot of time and a little bit of insanity, it demonstrated one fact about siege warfare. You could always tear it down from below if you couldn't get over or through the wall. The attackers were not alone responsible for the drama of siege warfare. Defenders had their own lethal strategies for each tower that rolled forward or ram that was constructed, and occasionally, those strategies were sexy. Let's begin with the scariest of them all. Greek fire. Around the 7th century CE, the Byzantines developed Greek fire was an enigmatic, napalm-like material that adhered to body and ship walls and continued to burn even on water. It produced scenes of complete mayhem when it was sprayed from siphons or thrown in clay pots. Nobody is certain how it was made to this day. The formula's effects were legendary, but it was so secret that it perished with the empire. Within minutes, entire fleets were reduced to flame skeletons, and that was only the beginning. Boiling liquids were the preferred weaponry in lower-tech fortifications. Murder holes, those charming apertures in the ceilings of gateways or towers, would pour boiling water, oil, or sand straight onto intruders below. People were particularly afraid of oil. In contrast to water, it adhered to flesh, seeping into armor and clothing before being exposed to light. Imagine arriving at the top of a siege ladder to find yourself facing an uncontrollable fire. Despite being less dramatic, hot sand was nonetheless cruel. From a distance, it didn't appear remarkable, but in a matter of seconds, it transformed brave soldiers into screaming wrecks by slipping into the crevices in the armor, particularly around the neck or wrists, and cooking the flesh underneath, resulting in second and third-degree burns. The good old rules of physics were also invoked by the defenders. The use of gravity as a weapon. On siege engines or in thick unit formations, parapets dropped giant stones, logs, or even dead animals. In addition to killing, the objective was to simultaneously destroy the machines and morale. There were also traps, bridges that collapse, hidden holes, and spiked barricades. Castles evolved into painful riddles intended to gradually perplex and punish. This was all done for one reason: to postpone. The enemy's supply lines were getting thinner, sickness was developing in the camps, or reinforcements were coming every minute a wall was held. Siege warfare was an attrition-based game. Additionally, the defenders had ingenuity and a great deal of raging anger, while the assailants had the advantage of physics. Raw devastation was only half the objective of siege warfare. Before the fortifications were even taken down, the other half was psychological dominance that broke the defender's will. Siege weapons were enormous, groaning, burning emblems of doom, rather than merely instruments of battle. The purpose of every groaning siege tower wheel and every arcing rock thrown by a trebuchet was to sow one seed in the thoughts of people inside the walls: you're not secure. Ancient leaders were aware of this. With great fanfare, the Assyrians publicly displayed their siege engines and pulled them over deserts. The Romans positioned their siege camps directly in front of the enemy, allowing the defenders to observe the assembly of battering rams and the testing of catapults. Fear was a part of the narrative for siege, and occasionally the payloads themselves conveyed a message. Often still in their armor, severed heads of generals or messengers would be hurled over the walls. In addition to rocks, bodies were also thrown upon the defenders during the siege of Constantinople. Launches of diseased corpses to spread illness and fear. It is thought that throwing bodies afflicted with the plague over the walls of Kaffa during the Mongol siege in 1346 contributed to the spread of the Black Death throughout Europe. The trebuchet served as an announcement as well as a weapon. Before they could see it, everyone in the fortress heard one of these giants being rolled into position. The hefty clunk of the counterweight, the grinding of ropes, and the groaning of winches all sound like the heartbeat of an impending storm. However, the uncertainty is the most hazardous aspect. You had no idea what would happen next. Would it be a barrel of fire or a rock? Silence or a shower of arrows foreboding oppressive quiet while engineers refocused? The noises even turned into psychological weapons. The abrupt hush before a shot, or the steady beat of a battering ram, would make defenders anxious. In order to persuade the enemy that resistance was futile, that their gods had deserted them, and that their walls were merely temporary barriers in the path of fate, commanders sought to instill a sense of hopelessness. When that mental barrier finally broke, the gates frequently opened without any resistance because, in siege warfare, occasionally the mind would collapse in front of the masonry. The era of conventional siege engines gradually came to an end when gunpowder roared into the battlefield in the late medieval period. However, their legacy persisted. Everything changed when cannons were invented. What a trebuchet took hours to accomplish could be accomplished in seconds with a single well-placed shot from a cannon. Once thought to be invincible, stone walls now pose a risk. By the 15th century, iron balls falling through the parapets of Europe's great castles were causing them to collapse, not fire or undermining. The next stage of siege warfare was explosive, cruel, and noisy. However, the foundations established by the ancient siege engineers have endured. The catapult and trebuchet continue to be a source of inspiration for modern artillery. All long-range howitzers and ballistic missiles are only sophisticated offspring of the same queer. How do you break